on the other hand, characteristics that are stereotypically labeled as masculine or feminine do exist as part of a continuum, and they're shared in varying degrees by each man and each woman. And certainly there may be innate patterns in the sort of virtues and vices that women and men in general, on balance, tend to gravitate towards, but those are sort of statistical statistical norms. They're not ethical norms that people are therefore obliged to conform to. And on the other hand, there's a growing movement among young men, certainly in the West, to want to rediscover and reassert a specifically masculine identity. And sometimes, by no means always, this includes some of the well-worn stereotypes of, the tough, dominant male and the submissive female whose place is in the home. And more worryingly for us, there are some enthusiasts for that sort of stereotype who find their way to the Orthodox Church because they believe that it affirms and supports that sort of stereotypical relationship between the sexes. And I don't want to overemphasize this. This is a small group. It's a small subset even of the young male converts to Orthodoxy who think in those terms, albeit one with, I believe, quite a significant presence online and social media and quite loud voices. But the problem I would underline is not that people are finding their way to the church for, so to speak, the wrong reasons. Arguably, all of us, have some motivations, reasons for being in the church, which are not pure love for God, which need to be transformed. But the problem arises if people's experience within the church fails to challenge and transform the habits of fallen human thought that they bring with them from secular society. And these sort of caricatures of masculinity and femininity are just such habits of fallen human thought. So this phenomenon does invite us to take a really hard look at the extent to which our parishes and church institutions are actually male-dominated, even in areas of activity that are fully open to the laity. There are all sorts of things that women have done in parishes, even liturgically, reading in church, for instance. As soon as there are plenty of men to choose from, the men will get precedence over the women, even if it's somebody who was, baptized last week. And, this sort of thing can be a real problem in parishes. These are ways in which our parishes, our church institutions can be frustrating and alienating for many devoted women who would really love to be able to use their talents in the service of the church. And increasingly, they may be deciding simply to give up the struggle and leave the Orthodox Church. And I should say that my own experience has almost universally been very positive. I'm not speaking primarily from my own experience, but I think it would be selfish and insensitive not to take the opportunity to point out that there are quite a lot of Orthodox women who do feel quite disturbed by a sense of male dominance within the church. And I believe, though, that the place and the example of the Mother of God can indeed challenge unhelpful stereotypes of femininity and masculinity, which lead to this sort of two-tier church community. And the Mother of God arguably can be seen as the first to follow the pattern that's set out by her Son when he unites us to ourselves by removing the difference between male and female, as St. Maximus says, and showing us instead to be simply human beings. But as with every aspect of the work of Christ, this is something that we have to work on appropriating for ourselves and making a reality in our communities. It's not something that happens automatically. And over the years that Orthodox have been confronted with questions about, the place of women in the church, so not infrequently there are rather complacent attempts simply to dismiss the question by pointing to the very exalted place of the Mother of God. Well, indeed, the honor paid to the Mother of God should and can be a catalyst for honoring all women no less than men, and valuing no less than men the gifts that they can bring to the entire church community. But to make the honor of the Mother of God a substitute for paying attention to the position of actual women in the church, that, I fear, is self-delusion. So how does the Mother of God guide us towards becoming simply human beings and, importantly, interacting with each other in that way? Let me just get some water. Thank you. I want to begin this section by quoting an English writer of the 20th century, G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was very good at generating pithy phrases, one of which is "men are men, but man is a woman," man meaning collectively mankind. If we look at the context of this remark, it's actually rather disappointing, because what he says is men, meaning males, may present a more or less rational appearance, but humanity as a whole is changeful, mystical, fickle, delightful. Sounds a bit patronizing. And this turns out to be just another illustration of a rather depressing tendency in many cultures to label as feminine aspects of human nature that people generally, or perhaps particularly men, feel somewhat uncomfortable or ambivalent about. And yet, that saying of Chesterton's has always stayed with me, because quite apart from what he actually meant it to say, if you take this aphorism on its own, man is a woman, it suggests to me quite a different and much more profound meaning. If we think of the divine economy and the human role within it, it's actually eerily accurate to say that man is a woman, not a generic woman, and most certainly not a woman who is changeful, fickle, or whatever, but the most holy Mother of God specifically, because it was in her person that mankind finally and definitively said yes to God. That's why all creation rejoices in her. As the Greek theologian Panagiotis Nellis puts it, she is the end, the goal of the history of the chosen people, the fulfillment of all the hopes and all the longings of mankind. And you'll recall how often in the Old Testament the nuptial imagery, marriage imagery, is used of God and his people, Israel. The people of Israel is summed up in a woman, the bride that God longs for and longs for her to be faithful to him. And even more to the point, as Nellis continues, this is drawing on Nicholas Kabasilas, the Mother of God manifested the human being as he was in the beginning in paradise and as he should have become. In other words, she is, in a sense, recapitulating Adam as well as Eve, in that she is human nature responding in the intended way to God. So at the Annunciation, the Mother of God speaks for mankind as a whole, entering into this synergy with God in which Adam and Eve both failed. But as a woman, as the bride of God, according to one of the striking titles found in our hymnography and prayers, she also images the manner in which each human being relates to God, because it's the calling of all of us to be the bride of Christ collectively as the church, and severally as those clothed in wedding garments, which are also our baptismal robes, awaiting the bridegroom. In the remainder of this talk, I want to look at some important examples of ways in which the Mother of God is a paradigm for all humanity in relation to God. And in her role in the divine economy, yes, but also in the virtues that she exemplifies, and including those that might be thought of as characteristically, or one might say stereotypically, feminine. And I want to argue that virtues such as humility, obedience, selfless love, these are not a straitjacket for women, and nor are they a threat of an inappropriate feminization for men. They are actually the royal road which is set before us for becoming simply human in Christ. And here I really want to acknowledge a debt to others with much greater scholarly expertise in the ways in which the Mother of God has been venerated and written and spoken about and praised throughout church history in hymnography, the lives, homilies. And above all, I want to pay tribute to a woman who would have been actually vastly better qualified than I am to give a talk such as this, who is Mary Cunningham, may be known to some of you certainly by name, of blessed memory. She died last September. And she was a superb Byzantine scholar of very great integrity and very great generosity, and also the author of many authoritative and highly regarded writings on the Mother of God in Byzantine literature and practice, and also a very dear friend of mine for about 45 years. So Mary's work has been invaluable to me in preparing the present talk, although I must say I have just taken a few snippets of it. As we know, the early explosion of interest in the figure of the Mother of God, when I say early, I mean 5th century, this had to do mainly with her significance for Christology, that she is the guarantor of the real humanity of God incarnate, hence the title Mother of God. The anthropological dimension, looking both at her as a person, as a woman, and as an example of humanity in relation with God, this was developed rather later. And a particular contemporary concern, although it's not something that has only been discovered in the modern era, is the place of human freedom in the Virgin's response to God's plan, what Nellis once again calls the divine human mystery of synergy. And Bishop Kallistos of Dioclea, who was with us in Yash the last time that I was here, he was the keynote speaker at IOCTA, now also, alas, sadly departed. But he would often emphasize this point very strongly, that when the Archangel Gabriel announced God's plan to Mary, he waited for her to reply. God did not become human without first seeking the willing agreement of the one who was to be his mother. Her voluntary consent was an essential prerequisite. At the Annunciation, she was a fellow worker with God, not simply a pliant tool, but an active participant in the mystery. And that, as I say, is something that is very important for people today who don't like the idea of simply having to fall in with a preordained plan, even if it's God's plan. The Christian idea of synergy is something much more complex. Earlier patristic writers are not so explicit about the Mother of God's freedom and voluntary consent, and we might say today active agency, but they actually show a very lively sense of her assent as a free and conscious decision. And the way this is expressed, it's interesting, it's through the literary form and the prevalence of dialogue in homilies and hymns on the Annunciation. Now, dialogue poems early on were, or dialogue in homilies, was by no means confined to the Annunciation. It was a very popular form, originating, I think, in the Syriac tradition, and then inspired Greek liturgical texts that would incorporate dialogue. Often, not always, this elaborates a dialogue that's already present in much more abbreviated form in Scripture, as at the Annunciation. The dialogue, any sort of discussion, and particularly the developed dialogue, presents the Virgin as, one might say colloquially, not a pushover. You know, she's not that readily persuaded. And interestingly, for the Church Fathers, this seems to have coexisted quite happily with the notion that she conceived through her ear, as many writers say, which is to say that the message of the archangel itself effected the conception of Christ. You know, there wasn't some sort of additional, any other procedure required. Annunciation hymnography is unusual in that the dialogue element remains prominent even today, though it's principally now confined to the Canonate Matins for Annunciation. But that survival is perhaps an indication of the enduring importance that's attached to the element of synergy, the fact that there is a real discussion between the Virgin and the angel in the process of the Annunciation. Because in the hymnography, Mary isn't simply querying how she can possibly bear a child given that she's a virgin, which is what she asks in the Gospel. She's also acutely aware that there is a very dangerous precedent for a virgin being approached by a mysterious stranger bearing a message contrary to what she thought she knew. She's therefore quite concerned to establish the angel's bona fides. You know, is this really an angel from God? And according to the canon, she says, "My mother Eve, accepting the suggestion of the serpent, was banished from divine delight, and therefore I fear thy strange salutation, for I take heed lest I slip." The picture consistently in dialogues like this is quite a bit more nuanced than simply obedience versus disobedience. And it's interesting that the fatal flaw that comes across as being characteristic of Eve certainly isn't that she should have been blindly obedient, and instead of which she thought for herself. In a way, it's the opposite. Eve was too ready simply to believe what she was told. She was naive. She didn't use her God-given intelligence and prudence to question whether a talking snake was really a reliable authority to put her trust in. And Mary, by contrast, exemplifies good judgment and responsible agency. And to quote Mary Cunningham talking about this, the Mother of God is the archetypal wielder of human free will according to God's original intention. Humans were meant to be free. They were meant to make a real a choice to align their will with his, but there's a right and wrong way of using that freedom. And of course, the Mother of God does also exemplify obedience and humility. And yes, these might be considered, and often have been considered, feminine virtues, but more accurately, I think they could be thought of as Christian virtues that are perhaps more often, and perhaps often more effectively, enjoined upon women than men. But it's highly significant here. If you look at the epistle reading for the birth and the dormition of the Mother of God, you have the Prokeimenon, which is from Luke, for he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden, for behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. Humility is the road to being exalted. And that is followed by the reading from Philippians 2, 5 to 11, in which it's not the Virgin, it's her Son who humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. The pattern is identical in mother and son. Blessing and exaltation come through self-abasement and obedience. And this is the pattern enjoined upon all of us. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. It's worth noting that the universal and pan-human value of humbling oneself still stands, even if one wants to see the Mother of God as an example of something particularly feminine. I'm thinking, for instance, of the French-Russian theologian Paul Evdokimov, who is very attracted by the idea of male and female archetypes. And on the basis of the Deesis icon, he proposes as the male archetype John the Baptist, obviously appears in that icon with the Mother of God on either side of Christ. But John the Baptist is a figure so strongly associated with his saying that I must decrease, that the feast of his birth has even been fixed accordingly. It's the summer solstice, so that the daylight is itself starting to decrease, starting to wane from that point, starting from the date of his birth. And it's Evdokimov, too, who points to the Virgin in her maternal purity as the most powerful expression of divine philanthropia. So even, as it were, beyond the incarnation, there is something that the Mother of God exemplifies, which is characteristic of God, and therefore, of course, should be characteristic of his image in humans. The language that's applied to various virtues and characteristics can sometimes obscure the convergence of characteristics that we see in people of holiness, convergence on the simply human. I mean, this is something that's often struck me with people I've met who clearly are holy, that whether they're men or women, it's not that they're sort of masculine or effeminate, but they're not, they're much more simply human than archetypal examples of their own sex. But if we look at the way this is described, lives of female saints may well praise them explicitly for acquiring manly virtues such as strength and courage. Conversely, if we look at male saints and ascetics particularly, they're often depicted as examples of humility and meekness, of obedience, certainly, selflessness, tenderness. But I may be wrong, but I'm not aware that they're ever explicitly praised for acquiring feminine virtues, even though the qualities of that sort are more often associated with women than with men. Interestingly, however, those virtues are also very obviously monastic virtues, or more accurately, based on what I was saying a moment ago, they're really Christ-like virtues, but they're ones cultivated among both sexes rather more successfully in monasteries than in wider society, and that goes even for self-professed Christian societies. I was told that the great elder Emilianos of Simonopetra, one of the pioneers of the revival of monasticism in the Holy Mountain in the 60s and 70s, once remarked that it's the hardest thing in the world for a Greek man to become a real monk because of the pride and the ego that's typically instilled into young boys from the moment of their birth. That was in the 1970s. I have to say, from my experience of Greece, social attitudes have improved a bit since. But it's an interesting observation. It's not surprising, then, to find the Mother of God hailed as a monastic figure. And again, in the Akathistos, she's described as the rampart, the wall of defense for virgins, and that's taken as meaning virgins of both sexes, monastics, male and female. Gregory Palamas speaks of her at some length as a hesychast, describes how she was trained in stillness and contemplation during the years of her childhood in the temple. And that actually rings true with some of the quite few descriptions we have in the Gospels of her mentality and her reactions to things, the fact that she kept all these things in her heart. This clearly speaks of a person of contemplation, of inwardness. And Palamas, of course, is building already on the Athonite tradition of the Mother of God as a monastic figure, but also a powerful figure, the queen and abbess of the Holy Mountain, a figure of spiritual authority. Again, referring to Mary Cunningham's work, she suggests that the Virgin's perceived intercessory power comes in part because she exists both within but also outside a predominantly male celestial and ecclesiastical hierarchy, But one could equally say that that too mirrors the ambivalent role of monasteries themselves, historically and sometimes also today, in relation to the church hierarchy. There's, the Mother of God in the Magnificat talks about he has regarded the lower state of his handmaiden and put down the mighty from their seats. And monasteries too are, in a sense, a subversive element, a wild card within the church. I would suggest that beyond that, underlying the association of the Mother of God with the monastic and particularly hesychastic tradition, there's the close connection between the deification of human nature, which takes place in her womb, and the deification of each person, so the appropriation of the deification of human nature, which is the focus of the ascetic life. Again, quoting the Akathistos hymn, the Mother of God is at once the fair nursing mother of virgins and the bridal escort of holy souls. She's the bridal chamber of a marriage without seed, who also joins the faithful to the Lord. And this brings us back once again to the spiritual sense in which we can say that man is a woman. Because just as a woman, the Mother of God, is key to the restoration of humanity's relationship with God, so we must recognize that our personal relationship with God, our Christian life, has to be understood through imagery that is irreducibly feminine, the language of a bride or even mother, and that applies to men just as much as women. There's nothing exclusive about it because, of course, not everyone has the experience of being a bride or a mother, not even every woman does, but we all owe our life to a bride and a mother. So this taps into a universal experience. And an example of this, for instance, is St. Irenaeus using the language of the mother, not in relation to the Mother of God, but to the incarnation itself, where he speaks of the bread of the Father offering himself to us as milk for infants, the bread of the Father being the Son, so that we may be fed as from the breast of his flesh. More straightforward in a way is the language of the Mother of God as the nourisher of our life, and that's more common later on. And it's obvious how one gets to that sort of language, that she gives physical food to her child by a biological process, and that enables him to grow and thus to offer himself to us as food through a spiritual material process. But this is a pattern of transmission that, in a way, one can say echoes through the church, and one can even see it as defining the very important process of tradition in the church as something conveyed not by some sort of external process, but through one's own life, as given that one is an organ, a member of Christ's body. Elder Vasilios of Eviron, another very important Athonite figure, recently departed, has a really memorable image of what it conveys, what it means to convey the teaching of the church fathers in the proper way. And this is, I think, a very relevant passage to refer to, speaking here in the context of a theology faculty. Because Vasilios says, it's not a matter of going to a concordance and looking up what do the fathers have to say about this and that. Rather, it's a process similar to what goes on in the body of a nursing mother, that she consumes food, that becomes part of her body, and it becomes milk for her infant. And similarly, we need to read the words of the fathers, hear them, and be changed by them internally. And it's this that allows our metabolism and our spiritual metabolism, so to speak, to change those words so that we can then pass them on as true nourishment for others. As I say, I think that this is a very important image to keep in mind in teaching and indeed learning theology. The image of the bride is equally multifaceted. In Psalm 44, the bride of the king is the virgin, who will be brought to the king with her escorts. The bride of Christ is the church, as we read in 2 Corinthians, but the bride is also the individual soul, as we've already mentioned. And in the economy of the incarnation, the virgin's womb is the bridal chamber of the union of God and man, and Kavasilas calls her the bridal escort of human nature, bringing it to God in herself and by example to individual humans thereafter, because this is also the mystical union that every one of us is called to accomplish personally, and it is the mystery of deification. The very notion of deification actually inspires much the same question that the Virgin asks, according to one of those dialogues we were talking about in the Annunciation canon. How is it possible for the nature of mortals to undergo union with the Godhead? And the angel replies with the well-known image of the burning bush. The divine fire is there, but it does not consume what is mortal. A deification is often spoken of in terms of a nuptial mystery. It's very clearly in Maximus's mystagogy when he speaks about deification as the blessed and holy embrace in this awesome mystery of a union transcending mind and reason. And that's what he says the communion symbolizes, points towards in the liturgy. And he quotes Ephesians 5:32, but I speak of Christ and the church. So it's very clear in making this connection between the bridal imagery, the church, and the soul. And then he goes on to quote from the marriage service, the service of crowning, to speak of the soul as crowned with or for the first and only and unique Word and God. And the Word here is the bridegroom, indeed, but the bride is also reason-endowed, the reason-endowed creature. It also partakes of Logos. It's made according to the image of him who is the Logos, the Word. So there's no warrant here for the oft-repeated idea, which seems to me a rather unhelpful one, that Logos, rationality, articulacy, is a masculine rather than a feminine trait. I would say, again, this is very much something that humans are given and should aspire to fully possessing. But there's a sense in which we can all identify with the Mother of God, not only as bride, but even as mother. And I was talking earlier about sort of more abstract maternal imagery, but this applies also in some way to our relationship with the Word of God. According to St. Simeon, the new theologian, Christ talks in the parable of the kingdom in Matthew 22 about the king as making wedding feasts in the plural for his son, because each of the faithful and the sons of light, for each of the faithful and sons of light, this same marriage is performed in like and scarcely diverging manner. But Simeon goes further than that. He says that when we confess Christ and are taught the faith, we receive the word in us as a kind of seed, like the Mother of God, and if our hearts are pure, the divine fire becomes like dew. We are not burnt by this, the word that we have received. And through communion, we receive God made flesh from Mary, deifying us who share in his body. And thus the saints can say with Isaiah that we have given birth to a spirit of salvation, which we have brought forth upon the earth. So in this sense, every one of us is called not only to be the bride, but even in a sense to give birth to the Mother of God. And we are elevated, as Simeon points out, to be his kinsman, his mother, and his brothers. So far from any stereotypes then of femininity or indeed masculinity, I believe that the Mother of God gives us a really powerful example of the handmaid of the Lord, which can guide all of us to a deeper insight into what it means to be human. At the Annunciation, we sing more than once this wonderful verse from Psalm 95, "Tell forth from day to day the glad tidings of the salvation of our God." Through the intercessions of the Mother of God, then, may we all experience this joy of our salvation, in which we, all of us, are a new creation and making up together the body and the bride of Christ. Thank you very much.
Mulțumim pentru această prezentare frumoasă. Mulțumirea se concretizează și pentru un buchet de flori. Am purces astăzi cumva mai departe la discuția de aseară, care a rămas pornit de la o întrebare, și astăzi am reușit să o vedem în prezentarea dumneavoastră pe Maica Domnului ca fiind într-adevăr o paradigmă a umanității, nu doar o paradigmă a feminității în general. Și mulțumim pentru aceasta. Probabil vor fi și întrebări din sală, pentru că prezentarea a fost una care a stârnit, cred eu, poate emoții, dar în același timp și cumva căutări interioare, mai ales de la lucrurile pe care le-ați spus inițial și legătura pe care ați făcut-o atât de frumos între Maica Domnului, pe de o parte, ca imagine a umanității, dar în același timp și mod de viețuire în lumea monahală. M-aș îndrepta spre cei din sală pentru a vedea dacă sunt întrebări. Și până vin întrebările, să știți că aș avea eu nu neapărat o întrebare personală pentru mine, cât probabil pentru mulți dintre cei care ne urmăresc și în online, pornind de la dimensiunea aceasta pe care ați arătat-o și această dinamică a Maicii Domnului, în relația pe care o vedem între bărbați și femei, și v-ați raportat inclusiv la imaginea de mire, mireasă, și ați adus în discuție textul din Efeseni, Apostolul de la Efeseni. V-aș ruga dacă ați putea să ne spuneți în câteva cuvinte cum vedeți relația descrisă în Epistola către Efeseni, în Apostolul care se citește la taina cununiei, pornind de la imaginea aceasta a Maicii Domnului pe care ați descris-o ca paradigma umanității.
There was a word in the translation that I didn't get properly in the gist of your question. Yes. Yes.
What do you think about this? When said the man is the head of the woman,
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, perhaps if we can, you know, of course it's an important question, but perhaps we can have some other questions, and in the course of the discussion,
întrebări din sală? Părintele Cătălin? Și doamna Natalie de Praz?
Oui, mais, oui. Je vais parler en français de façon à pouvoir être traduite ensuite par Felicia Dumas. Et peut-être en anglais, vous aurez la traduction directement depuis le roumain qui vous sera traduit, je pense. Avec mon prêtre à la paroisse où je suis à Paris, une paroisse orthodoxe francophone qui est rattachée au patriarcat de Serbie, de Belgrade, j'ai une discussion très fréquente concernant le type de travail spirituel spécifique que peuvent ou doivent faire les femmes.
Împreună cu preotul dumneaei, părintele Marc Jenin, de la parohia francofonă, care depinde de patriarhia sârbă de la Belgrad, a avut de nenumărate ori discuții referitoare la rolul duhovnicesc pe care femeia trebuie să-l aibă în biserică.
Et donc si, comme vous l'avez rappelé, le dit Chesterton, l'homme au sens de man, masculin, est une femme,
Ori, dacă în conformitate cu ceea ce ați afirmat dumneavoastră pornind de la Chesterman, că omul este de fapt o femeie,
et donc que la Theotokos est un paradigme pour l'humanité, et que la Theotokos est un paradigme pour l'humanité,
iar născătoarea de Dumnezeu este o paradigmă pentru omenire,
on comprend que les hommes, men, au sens masculin, doivent travailler spirituellement en tâchant de se conformer au paradigme marial de l'humilité.
înțelegem că bărbații trebuie să aibă roluri duhovnicești conformându-se la modelul marian al Maicii Domnului, al smereniei.
Mais qu'en est-il des femmes?
Dar de fapt ce se întâmplă cu femeile, care este rolul lor specific?
Sont-elles concernées?
Cum le vedeți poziționate în această ecuație?
Quel est leur travail spirituel spécifique?
Care este rolul și lucrarea lor duhovnicească specifică?
D'un point de vue féministe, on pourrait dire qu'elles pourraient se sentir invisibilisées,
Dintr-o perspectivă feministă, am putea înțelege că ele se simt un pic invizibilizate, devin invizibile,
c'est-à-dire non concernées, non prises en compte dans leur travail spirituel propre.
adică neluate în seamă și în ceea ce privește lucrarea lor duhovnicească specifică.
Qu'en pensez-vous?
Care este părerea dumneavoastră pornind de la aceste afirmații?
Are you talking about spiritual work, the work that we need to do on ourselves, or
Vorbiți de lucrarea duhovnicească, aceea pe care trebuie să o facem asupra noastră înșine? Răspunsul este da.
It seems to me that this is a question for each person.
Am impresia că aceasta este o întrebare pentru fiecare persoană, pe care fiecare ar trebui să-și o pună.
I'm not sure that one can generalize. You know, each of us has our own, besetting sins and tendencies that we need to work on.
Nu cred că putem generaliza. Fiecare dintre noi are anumite lucruri asupra cărora trebuie să lucreze, anumite tendințe pe care poate trebuie să le schimbe.
I'm not sure to what extent there are patterns, they fall into patterns that, men have these spiritual problems and women have others.
Nu știu în ce măsură putem vorbi de existența unor anumite pattern-uri, modele. Nu știu în ce măsură putem spune că bărbații au anumite probleme, iar femeile altele la care au de lucru.
I think it can be a problem in the church when there are, you talked about women feeling invisible, and as I said at one point, I mean, that certainly hasn't been my experience. I know there are Orthodox women for whom that tends to be their experience in the church, sadly.
Ați menționat și dumneavoastră această idee că unele femei poate se simt oarecum invizibile în biserică, dar aceasta nu este neapărat și experiența mea.
And I think there are difficulties when within the church one's getting mixed messages.
Și cred că sunt oarecum anumite dificultăți în interiorul bisericii când e vorba să transmitem asemenea mesaje.
You know, that somebody may have heard, perhaps from their own spiritual father, may have a certain vision of what it means to be a human being, and for a woman as much as a man, but this can clash with social expectations that they equally encounter with the church, which might be much more rigid about the sorts of, different sorts of behavior that's expected of women and of men.
Și probabil că vedem în biserică și anumite păreri, poate că unii influențați de duhovnic au o anumită viziune a ceea ce înseamnă să fii om ca femeie sau ca bărbat și poate că uneori există anumite așteptări în biserică care sunt oarecum mai rigide în privința comportamentului femeilor sau a bărbaților.
Thank you. Another question? Părintele Cătălin.
Hristos a înviat, numele meu este Cătălin Vatamanu, sunt conferențiar la Catedra de Vechiul Testament la Facultatea de Teologie aici în Iași. Doamna profesor, felicitări pentru această prelegere care a provocat cu siguranță în fiecare dintre noi întrebări. Cumva eu personal m-am regăsit foarte mult în ceea ce ați prezentat din perspectiva Vechiului Testament. Am lecturat prezentarea dumneavoastră cu ochelarii veterotestamentarului și, prin urmare, nu neapărat că vreau să pun o întrebare, cât mai degrabă să vă dau un feedback la ceea ce eu am luat de la dumneavoastră și vreau să duc mai departe. Și anume faptul că în Vechiul Testament relația dintre Dumnezeu și poporul ales este prezentat printr-o logodnă. Cât de frumos profetul Ieremia în capitolul 3, versetul 4, în textul ebraic și nu în textul tradus în limba română pe care îl avem acolo, zice Israel se adresează lui Dumnezeu: Tu ești prietenul tinereților mele. O expresie pe care noi am păstrat-o în acatistul Mântuitorului Iisus Hristos atât de frumos. Și înțelegerea legată de logodnă în Vechiul Testament e tocmai aceea că bărbatul își lua soția ca logodnică și, așa cum bine știm, nu era o consumare a unei căsătorii, o consumare trupească, cât bărbatul se ducea mai întâi acasă ca să construiască casă, să zicem, soției, să construiască lăcaș soției pentru a o aduce în propria familie. Așa se face că lectura Noului Testament, mesajul Mântuitorului Iisus Hristos, este dincolo de a înțelege teologia și partea aceasta socială veterotestamentară, e un mesaj care ține de eschatologie, care ține de experiența noastră de viață, care ține de relația dintre Hristos și Biserică, așa cum ați arătat atât de frumos, pentru că Mântuitorul Iisus Hristos, la Ioan capitolul 14, versetele 2-3, zice că în casa Tatălui meu sunt multe locașuri și eu vă voi aduce pe voi acolo. Iată că avem de-a face în această perspectivă eschatologică pe care noi o trăim. Te traduce, Doamne. Mai rar, scuze. Așadar, avem de-a face cu o perspectivă eschatologică, o perspectivă eclezială, și anume că Mântuitorul Iisus Hristos este Cel care pregătește casă pentru noi toți. Casa aceasta este, evident, Biserica, ca anticipare, ca trăire într-un mod aici și acum, de fapt, a Împărăției lui Dumnezeu și a veșniciei. Cu iertare că am zis repede, așa sunt eu, iertați. Mulțumesc tare mult.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that. It's fascinating, and I think shows us just the richness of thinking further about the marital imagery of God and the church, God and the whole human race.
Mulțumesc frumos, vă sunt recunoscătoare pentru aceste gânduri pe care le-ați împărtășit și cred că asta nu face decât să arate încă o dată bogăția acestui mod de a gândi, acestor imagini nupțiale a unirii dintre Dumnezeu și Biserică, dintre Dumnezeu și umanitate.
Mai avem timp pentru o întrebare, Părintele.
Mulțumesc și eu și sunt recunoscător pentru prezentarea pe care ați făcut-o. Ne întâlnim la un an diferență de la o altă conferință pe care ați ținut-o la Patmos, unde ați vorbit despre creația lui Dumnezeu și în care excelați, despre grija noastră față de creație. Întrebarea mea se dorește a fi o provocare sau un potențial care să aibă cel puțin un potențial răspuns din partea dumneavoastră, nu pentru mine, ci pentru studenții noștri. O parte sunt aici în sală sau poate via mass media ajunge la toți cei care n-au reușit să fie aici. Și se referă la situația pe care o avem pastoral vorbind, nu teologic și tehnic. Aseară s-a vorbit despre antinomie și paradox. Un paradox legat de Maica Domnului este pururea fecioria. La Sinodul al VI-lea Ecumenic s-a dogmatizat această învățătură, iar în situația noastră pastorală, faptul că unii necredincioși sau atei spun că nu este firesc să se afirme așa ceva, nu ne interesează prea mult. Dar faptul că unii creștini neoprotestanți Nu numai că spun că nu este adevărat, ci chiar că este o aberație să afirmăm că Maica Domnului este fecioară după naștere, ne face ca noi nu numai să proclamăm pe Maica Domnului, ci să o apărăm pe Maica Domnului. Dumneavoastră trăiți într-un mediu heterodox, sau unde ortodoxia nu are un statut foarte clar și majoritar. Pentru noi ortodoxi e foarte simplu. Dar aș vrea să ne spuneți, de ce a fost nevoie să se dogmatizeze această chestiune, pururea fecioria Maicii Domnului, și cum spuneam, chiar unii teologi spun, nu e o problemă dacă a fost fecioară înainte, nu e o problemă dacă a fost fecioară la naștere. Problema este că e practic rațional imposibil să acceptăm că cineva poate să rămână fecioară după naștere. Și cum ați argumenta unui om care spune, nu pot să accept așa ceva, cum ați argumentat din punct de vedere satisfăcător, rațional, că Maica Domnului rămâne pururea fecioară? Nu mă refer la dimensiunea biologică și morală. Acestea pentru noi sunt scoase ci la cum ați argumentat din punctul de vedere al necesității mele teologice, spirituale, duhovnicești, de a accepta această învățătură, ca să o înțeleagă sau să o accepte și ceilalți. Mulțumesc!
Thank you. Yes, I can see that this is pastorally an important question.
Îmi dau seama că este o chestiune importantă la nivel de pastorație. Mulțumesc pentru întrebare.
I think it's also probably a bit beyond my competence, and as I said before, this is really not an area of scholarship where I'm an expert.
Dar, cum am spus și mai înainte, cred că îmi depășește un picuț competențele pentru că nu sunt expert în acest domeniu.
But I do recall, a fine scholar and theologian and translator, Father Ephraim Lash, who was a great friend of mine. I think it was quoting a professor of his saying, "Gentlemen," because they were all gentlemen, "this has nothing to do with gynecology."
Dar îmi amintesc ce spunea un prieten al meu, teolog și traducător, pe nume Lash, și spunea, domnilor, asta nu are nimic de a face cu ginecologia.
And I remember there's an interesting book of journals translated into English from a remarkable Russian emigre woman, Yulia de Bosob.
Și îmi amintesc de asemenea că avem în limba engleză o carte, un fel de jurnal, scris de o femeie din emigrația rusă, Yulia, scuze, n-am înțeles celălalt nume.
Yulia de Bosob, and she describes how approaching death, she'd been married, she was a widow, they'd had a child who had died in infancy of starvation. But she talks at her approaching death about reclaiming, growing into a spiritual virginity.
Și această femeie, apropiindu-se de ceasul morții, fusese căsătorită, era văduvă, a avut un copil care a murit de mic, de foame, își amintește în acest moment și vorbește în acest moment al apropierii morții de un fel de recuperare a fecioriei.
And that I think points to the way, I at least would understand the perpetual virginity of the Mother of God.
Și asta ne ajută oarecum să înțelegem această feciorie veșnică a Maicii Domnului.
It's not about biological changes that, perhaps I'm being a Western rationalist, but it seems to me that if she produced a child and produced milk to feed him, she had undergone biological changes in her body, which are not, in that sense, her body was not that of a virgin.
Și femeia aceasta dăduse naștere unui copil, îl hrănise la sân, deci trecuse prin niște schimbări biologice în trup.
But in terms of a soul in relation to God,
vorbește de feciorie în relația ei spirituală cu Dumnezeu.
She remains totally focused in a sense. God was her only love, her only bridegroom.
Ea a rămas concentrată la nivel spiritual pe Dumnezeu. Într-un fel, Dumnezeu a fost singurul ei mire.
I'm afraid that's the best I can do on that.
Cred că acesta e cel mai bun răspuns pe care pot să vi-l dau.
But I would also like to come back to the very important question that you raised, Father Cezar, about the husband as the head of the wife.
Dar aș vrea să mă întorc la întrebarea pe care a spus-o la început Părinte Cezar, și anume această imagine a bărbatului drept cap al femeii.
And I think, sayings like this and the particular relationship within a marriage has to be understood paradoxically in the wider context in which both of us are brides of God, and we live that out in different ways because one is a husband and one is a wife, and because we're different personalities.
Și mă întorc de asemenea la această relație de căsătorie care trebuie înțeleasă paradoxal într-un context mai larg, în ideea că în căsătorie atât bărbatul cât și femeia sunt mirese ale lui Dumnezeu, iar această experiență a trăirii acestui statut de mireasă lui Dumnezeu este diferită pentru bărbat și pentru femeie.
But as to how far this becomes a pattern for society, I think we have to recognize that there are really different ways of thinking about this in the church today.
Și dacă ne gândim la anumite modele de comportament pentru societate, de asemenea, în zilele noastre trebuie să ne gândim și la faptul că în biserică sunt diferite moduri de a conceptualiza această relație și comportamentul bărbaților și al femeilor.
Do we say that the model of the first century remains normative? Women being silent, and if there's something they don't understand, they ask their husbands.
Mai putem oare să credem că poate să rămână valabil modelul din primul secol, atunci când se credea că femeile trebuie să tacă și dacă nu înțeleg ceva să-i întrebe pe soții lor?
Or do we recognize that there are actually ways in which social norms can change without impairing the theology and the understanding of a relationship between men and women within this understanding of Christ as the bride of the church, as a bridegroom of the church.
Sau recunoaștem că există moduri în care rolurile sociale s-ar putea schimba fără a aduce vreun prejudiciu teologiei sau modului în care înțelegem relația dintre bărbat și femeie ca fiind similară relației dintre Hristos și biserică.
So instead of an answer, I've just thrown back the suggestion that there are a whole lot more questions to be discussed.
Și iată că în loc să vă răspund, am adus aici pe masă alte sugestii care dau naștere altor întrebări.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thanks for your presentation. And because pentru că timpul a trecut, mulțumim pentru aceste prezentări, pentru răspunsuri. Mai putem discuta, să știți, în perioada de pauză, că am intrat în pauză și dați-mi voie să anunț că pauza va dura jumătate de oră, o pauză de cafea, pentru un ceai, pentru o apă, până la ora 11, când vă așteptăm din nou în această sală pentru prima sesiune dedicată familiei creștine, vocație și instituție. Tot o sesiune în limba engleză. Mulțumim mult!